Well, the Palestinian Authority president is now urging Hamas to speed up an exchange of captives for prisoners with Israel. Mahmoud Abbas said it would spare Palestinians from more devastating Israeli attacks and a possible Israeli ground offensive in Rafah. Well, let's bring in Charles Stratford. He joins me now from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Charles, what should we make of that statement from Abbas? It feels that the split between Fatah and Hamas is still very evident.
I think that is very evident, the split very much there. Certainly speaking to analysts here in the occupied West Bank, they're saying that this basically highlights in many ways just how ineffectual the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is in these ongoing efforts to try and forge a deal between Hamas and Israel, to try and get some sort of ceasefire, some sort of prisoner and captive swap initiated in order to avoid what everybody is very worried about, which certainly Abbas highlights there, could well be, in his words, a catastrophe in Rafah, if indeed this expected potential invasion of Rafah by Israeli forces goes ahead. I'll just bring you a little bit more of that statement that was released on the Palestinian Authority's official news agency. Abbas went on to say, "We hold everybody responsible for placing any obstacles from any party to disrupt the deal because these are no longer tolerable. It is time for everyone to bear responsibility." I think it's also worth highlighting just how unpopular President Abbas is with the people here, not only Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, but in Gaza also. A recent opinion poll, some quite shocking statistics. 92% of people asked in the West Bank and 81% of Gazans asked the same question. And the question was, do they think that President Abbas should resign? And their answer was yes. So again, that highlights just his level of unpopularity here amongst Palestinians. And many analysts are saying this is evidence of Abbas obviously pandering to the Americans here. He has no power over Hamas. He has no power over Israel and Israel's ongoing behaviour, obviously, in Gaza and here in the West Bank, and seemingly no power really over the Americans. But it's interesting that this statement has been released at this time, and I think it's safe to say that it could also be seen as, if anything, a bit of a veiled criticism towards his arch-rival, Hamas.
Charlie, you're standing there in Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank. We know raids have been ongoing throughout that region as well. Talk us through what you've been hearing there over the last few hours.
Well, there are more Israeli military raids overnight in various locations across the occupied West Bank. We're hearing now from our sources, journalists that we know in Hebron, in the south of the occupied territories here, that there is an ongoing Israeli military raid on a village called Beit Omar. According to the Palestinian Red Crescent, at least 9 people have been injured so far in that raid. We didn't see, or we haven't seen, certainly over the last 24 hours or so, any more of these Israeli settler attacks that, of course, have increased dramatically, like the military raids, but have increased dramatically since the beginning of the war on October the 7th, following the Hamas attacks. According to the United Nations, well over 500 attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians and their property in the last 4 months or so. We've been looking at some of these attacks and how they vary, whether they be attacks directly on Palestinian property, on Palestinian farmland. But we've also been looking at the Bedouin community in the occupied West Bank and some of the attacks that they have to endure. We went down to an area in the north of the occupied territories, a place called Marajat, and spoke to a Bedouin community there. And this is our report.
Jihad Idais guards his herd. The goats are his family's main source of income, and he's worried the Israeli settlers will come back and take them away. Jihad lives in this Palestinian Bedouin community which has been here for 50 years. It's surrounded by illegal and expanding Israeli settlements that began appearing in the 1980s. He says the settlers recently forced him to pay a fine of 150,000 shekels, about $40,000, because they said his goats had strayed onto their land that, according to international law, is not theirs.
It was about 7:30 in the morning. I took my sheep to graze in a nearby area that I always go to. Suddenly, settlers with protection of Israeli soldiers attacked us and confiscated the animals. They threatened us and said either we pay or they would take the sheep away. Since the 7th of October, settlers are trying to kick us out more than ever before.
We go to speak to the settlement council. We are not allowed in, and after repeated phone calls are told to email the council's lawyer detailing the case. The Bedouin of the occupied West Bank have lived here for centuries. Members of one community tell us some of the attacks and stock theft have been led by this man. Zohar Saba lives in an illegal settler outpost close by. He passes us in his car as we walk, accompanied by Israeli human rights activists, to what we are told is another settler with goats.
Many of the Bedouin living in this area have had either their goats killed or, in some instances, their entire herds confiscated. We've come down to speak to an Israeli settler who has a herd of goats in the valley behind me. Many of these settlers are armed, and the Bedouin tell us that many of them have either the implicit or the actual practical support of the Israeli army in this area.
The young unarmed settler looks nervous and refuses to answer our questions about Zohar, who watches us from inside his car, which is parked on a nearby hill.
Zohar, excuse me.
A few minutes later, he ignores us as we try to flag him down.
Slowly, they're closing on them, and here, for example, few family already left. So it's quiet terror, but it's still terror.
The settlement council's lawyer replied to our email. He said Jihad had broken the law by allowing his goats to stray, but there was no mention of the fact the animals had roamed onto land occupied illegally by Israel, according to international law. Charles Strafford, Al Jazeera, Ma'ar Rajad, in the occupied West Bank.